Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Buttered Rum Ball Python, and I'll have to admit on this one, it actually sounded vaguely familiar to an alcoholic beverage. I actually went over to google.com and did a search, and sure enough, there's actually a drink called the Hot Buttered Rum. But instead of talking about an alcoholic beverage that you can get at your local pub, we're actually talking about a combination of genes in Boll Pythons. So the Buttered Rum actually consists of the butter, the calico, and the super pastel. As a matter of fact, you can make a hot buttered rum in Boll Pythons. If you actually look at some of the other combinations, for example, you actually have the hot chocolate, which is the combination of the chocolate and the fire. So technically, if you added fire to the buttered rum, you would get the hot buttered rum, similar name to the alcoholic beverage, which is kind of interesting. And if you actually look at the individual genes in the buttered rum, there's actually the calico, which is probably the most variable of the three different types of genes. You actually have the super pastel. Sometimes it can be a little variable. The butter, similar to the lesser, can be a little bit variable, but I'd say probably the most variable gene in the combination is the calico. As a matter of fact, a lot of people actually have their specific lines of calico. I'd say it's probably one of the only genes that I've seen pretty much widespread where people will put their own name on their version of the calico. So for example, a lot of these breeders will actually have like the breeder's name, like the business name in the front, and then on the end they'll have the calico. So that is their version of calico because it can really vary quite a bit. As a matter of fact, I actually just isolated my version of calico here in my reptile room, and this version that I have here actually brings out a lot of orange, like a really deep orange color, which is pretty awesome, pretty unusual for certain lines of calico. Sometimes you don't get any color, sometimes you get a lot of yellow in the calicos, and I say with most people when they think of calico, they're thinking of a lot of white that's coming up the sides of the snake, and sometimes you actually don't get a lot of white. Sometimes you'll bring in a lot more color versus bringing in a lot of white. Unless you actually mix the calico with something else, then sometimes you can actually increase the amount of white in the calico, which is kind of interesting. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the Buttered Rum Ball Python. Alright, so I want to jump over here on morphmarket.com and I want to start with the individual genes that make up the buttered rum, and then I want to show you some other genes mixed into this combination so you can see the true potential of what the buttered rum can do working other genes into the mix. And the first one I want to show you is this one right here. This is the butter, and a lot of people think that the butter and the lesser are almost exactly the same. As a matter of fact, I actually did a comparison video comparing the butter to the lesser, and what I found in that video, it seemed like in certain cases the butters can be a lot brighter than some of the lessers, and it seems like the lessers can be a lot darker than some of the darkest butters, although I'm starting to change my mind on this a little bit. As a matter of fact, I've been looking at all the butters over here in Morph Market, and they seem like that a lot of people are producing some really dark butters. Look at how dark the background is on this. You know, normally this is like as dark as your darkest lesser, which is kind of crazy. And keep in mind, both the butter and the lesser are both in the blue the cystic complex. So if you actually made like a super butter, breeding two butters together, 25% of the time you'd make an all white snake with blue eyes, which is pretty awesome. And the butters and the lessers are pretty much the king of white snakes. You can mix in any other gene in the blue-eyed leucistic complex and you'll end up with an all white snake, versus if, say for example, you actually took Mojave, which is also in the blue-eyed leucistic, sometimes it'll make like purplish colored snakes with the purple passions, or sometimes it can make kind of like a yellowish colored snake with the crystals, which is technically still a blue-eyed leucistic, but it's, let me tell you, when it comes to the butters and the lessers, you really don't get any of the purple colored snakes or the yellows. Pretty much they're all really super white. So here is the calico, probably the most variable gene in all of Boll Pythons. You know, I actually did a video on the variability of the calico, and it's pretty amazing how variable it can be. And I remember when I first started in Boll Pythons, I kind of had this image in my mind as far as what a calico should look like. And what I actually thought, I thought the calico brought in these splotches of white all through the snake, which in a lot of cases it actually does. Sometimes you'll have these really sharp definitions between the white and the color. Sometimes you'll you'll have like a kind of a gradual transition between the whites and the colors. And sometimes you won't have any white at all. Sometimes it can be kind of surprising. I've actually produced some of my collection. I'm like, what in the world did I produce? I did not know what they were when I first produced them. Come to find out, it was just a different version of the calico. Just the straight calico by itself didn't have any white on the side, but a lot of times on your calicos, you'll actually have a lot of streaking. That's a pretty good giveaway that you have calicos, because you'll have a lot of kind of the streaking of the patterns on the sides. And then a lot of times you'll actually have a lot of color coming in depending on your version of calico. So if you actually look at this one, there's almost no color coming in. And in my version, there's a lot of orange. In some versions, there's a lot of yellow. It's pretty amazing the different variability of the calico. As a matter of fact, my calico, the jean just by itself didn't have any white on the sides of it. But if you actually work it in with bamboo, you get a really high white combination, which is pretty interesting. And then I found that same version of calico, if you work it in with pinstripe, you get this really beautiful, kind of like this orangish gold color of a snake, which has pretty much no white on the side. It's a really interesting version of calico. So take a look at this. This is actually the combination of the calico and the butter. And look at the difference that this version of calico actually does on the side of the snake. Sometimes you'll actually get really sharp definitions of the white, like highly pixelated, really sharp definitions between the colors. And sometimes with the calicos, you'll just have kind of this line right down the middle where you'll have kind of this white coming up from the belly on the side of the snake. As a matter of fact, in a lot of combinations where you're not sure there's calico in there, sometimes you can actually look, and sometimes if there's this really definite line right down the middle of the snake where it's darker on top and lighter on the bottom, that's a pretty sure indication that you have calico in the mix. So here is the Super Pastel, the other ingredient to the buttered rum, which is kind of an interesting name for this combination. The Super Pastel, keep in mind that actually contains 2 copies of the pastel gene, which is a co-dominant gene, or incomplete dominance, as some people would like to say. You know, kind of the old time ball python breeders, they would use co-dominant, where you actually have a super form where you can have 2 copies of the gene. And it seems like the newer terminology is incomplete dominance instead of co-dominant. And it's kind of interesting with the Super Pastel. I'd say it can be pretty variable from one example to the other. Not quite as variable as the calico. Usually on a lot of your Super Pastels, you'll actually have a really scrambled up pattern. It really changes the pattern if you actually compare it to like a normal ball python with the alien heads. A lot of times you'll have a really strong pattern enhancing effect with a lot of your combinations working Super Pastel in. And I've actually found with a lot of Super Pastel combinations, a lot of times it'll bring in a lot of this kind of the white, or kind of this almost like this highlighting in the back. Sometimes it'll be really super dark, and then it'll have these highlights, especially right along the ridge. Sometimes it can actually, in certain combinations, it can be almost like a bright white background from the Super Pastel worked into that combination. So here's what happens if you mix all the genes together, the butter, the calico, and the Super Pastel. You get the buttered rum. And take a look at this. It's kind of a surprising combination when you add the Super Pastel on top of those other genes. It's pretty amazing. You get this kind of a creamy looking steak. It almost kind of looks like almost like a cross between like a Disco Inferno and maybe like a Freeway or something like that. A really unusual combination. And I've seen in a lot of these buttered rums, it seems like all of them have this really pale head on the top of the head, which is probably coming from the Super Pastel. A lot of your Super Pastel combinations can really fade out the head like that. And if you actually look at some of the, usually like right along the tail here, where you kind of see this little bit of fading, almost like someone like sandblasted the color off, that in a lot of cases is actually coming from your calico. The calico has that kind of an effect on a lot of your combinations. And then when you actually add the butter to the combination, the butter or the slash lesser, the butters and the lessers can actually bring in some yellow, and the butters can actually bring in a lot of your definition, where it really cleans it up and gives you more of a contrast between the different colors. But in this case, you kind of lose the effect of the really high contrast of the butter because of all the other genes, the calico and the Super Pastel. And I actually pulled up another version of the buttered rum over here. here. So this one has a lot of yellow, not really any orange in the combination. And I found another one over here. Take a look at this. This is probably the orange coming from a different version of the calico, which is pretty amazing. The calico can have a really big effect on the visual appearance of a lot of your combinations, especially if you have like the orange version of the calico. And you can actually see on this one, you have a lot of this faded out and right in the tail. I think that's not only from the calico, but I think it's probably from the combination of the super pastel and the calico really washing out spots on the side of the snake, which is pretty amazing. So here is the enchi. When you work enchi into the buttered rum, it has a pretty awesome effect. And essentially what the enchi is, it's a pattern reducing gene. A lot of people think, all right, I'm gonna add enchi, I'm gonna reduce the pattern and kind of jumble it up. You can actually see on this one, it really jumbles up the pattern on the side of the enchi. But what a lot of people don't know is the enchi will also bring in usually a lot of yellows or oranges into your combinations. It can enhance the color. Sometimes you can have certain lines of enchi that really enhance the brightness of a lot of your combinations. So for example, if you actually took enchi and worked it into some of your brightening genes, like the pastel, the fire, the orange dream, or the yellow belly, mix it into those combinations, it can even enhance the brightness of a lot of those combinations. So here's what happens if you actually work the enchi into the buttered rum. Take a look at this beauty. That's a pretty awesome effect working enchi in there. And you can definitely tell in this version of enchi, it's bringing in more yellow in the combination to really brighten it up and really reduce the pattern of the overall snake, which is pretty awesome. You can still see kind of a faded out head from probably from the super pastel in this combination. And you can actually tell on this one, it kind of has the line right down the middle that kind of breaks from the top and the bottom, indicating that you have calico in the mix that kind of breaks it up that way, which is pretty interesting. So here is the spider, probably one of the more controversial genes because some people say that the spider is associated with the head wobble, although I've actually produced quite a few spiders here in my collection. I haven't had any neurological issues with any of my spiders, and in some cases the spiders can have an extreme example of a neurological issue where, you know, I've actually seen some people, you know, as a matter of fact, I've actually seen reptile shows overseas that'll ban the spider gene, which is kind of crazy. And over here in the United States, we don't ban the spider gene. As a matter of fact, it's probably one of the most bittersweet genes, because if you work spider into a lot of combinations, it probably has the best effect as far as making some really amazing combinations. But unfortunately, a small, I'd say probably an extremely small percentage of the spiders have a problem with a neurological issue. The other thing with the spider is you don't want to breed two spiders together, or you don't want to breed spider to a champagne, because 25% of the time you'll actually get the lethal combination of the super spider or the spider champagne. So here's what happens if you work spider into the buttered rum with the enchi. I actually found one which has the enchi and the spider in the combination. Look at how beautiful this is. That is absolutely amazing with the combination of the spider. And you can actually tell if you start looking at these combinations that the buttered rum is extremely visually dominant. So when you work other genes into the combination, it has a really strong effect as far as kind of overwhelming the patterns and the colors of a lot of genes, which I thought was pretty interesting. So if you actually take a closer look at this, you almost can't even see the spider. Usually you get like a spider web pattern right down the top of the snake. You probably are breaking up the spider web pattern probably from the enchi. You're getting more of the enchi coming from the kind of this banding on the side. That is an indication that you have enchi in the mix, but it completely overwhelms the spider pattern, which is pretty amazing. So here is the leopard. This is the last one I want to show you, and I actually brought this example up to kind of test the visual dominance of this combination. So a lot of times when you work leopard into other combinations, you get a really strong darkening effect as far as darkening the background of a lot of your combinations, because it's a dark gene. And look at how dark the leopard's can be, like almost like an inkjet black background. And you mix it in with other combinations, I'd say probably 90% of the time you'll get a really strong darkening effect. And with the leopard, you'll also get a kind of a jumbled up pattern because it's a really strong pattern enhancing gene. As a matter of fact, the leopard works really well if you work it in with like the super pastel, which is a really strong pattern enhancer, or like the spot nose or the confusion. The really strong pattern enhancing genes can really make some really crazy patterns when you work it in with the leopard. So here's what happens if you take the leopard and you work it into the buttered rum. Take a look at this. This is pretty surprising. I couldn't believe how the buttered rum just almost completely overwhelmed the leopard as far as the dark, bringing in the dark into this combination. You can see a little bit of the dark coming in like around the head and right along the top from the influence of the leopard. But usually with the leopard, you get an even more of a darkening effect, which I found to be pretty surprising with this combination, because I haven't seen anything, you know, as far as looking at this combination that would be really super visually dominant pretty much across the board like I've seen with other combinations. And kind of the other interesting thing about this, you'll actually notice this has a really strong line right down the top of the snake. And usually when you work leopard with butter, or you can actually work leopard with lesser and butter are pretty much the same thing. But if you actually mix those with the leopard gene, I'd say probably about 80% of the time you'll actually get really strong striping right down the top of the snake from the combination of the leopard and the butter combination. And I'd say I've actually seen, you know, a lot of like butter leopard combinations, and as a matter of fact, I've actually seen some kind of side by side the same exact genes in similar snakes, and some of them have a really strong stripe and some don't have a stripe at all. I'd say you have a really strong influence as far as possibly getting a really striped snake with the combination of the butter and the leopard, but it's not always a striped snake, which is pretty fascinating. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Terry Beavers asks, my normal ball python has a little bit of a wobble. Is that normal? And that is a very good question. So when it comes to any kind of a genetic defect, like a neurological issue or any kinking in the spine or anything like that, a lot of people will actually associate those with specific genes in ball pythons. But I've actually seen pretty much across the board where any snake can potentially have a head wobble, similar to what you'd see in like a spider or champagne in some cases. I've actually seen some kinking in the spine. A lot of people associate with kinking in the spine where you actually can't completely straighten the spine of the snake because there's a genetic defect preventing it from completely straightening. A lot of people say that is in, a lot of times you'll actually find that like in the super cinnamons or the super black pastels or in the caramel albinos. But I'd say, you know, I tend to argue with that. I've actually seen a lot of people where they'll actually take caramel albinos and they'll breed them for like 20 or 30 years and never get any kinking in the spine of a caramel albino. And I've actually seen other people where they'll actually breed like a whole clutch of spiders, and every single offspring in the whole clutch will have severe neurological issues, where other people will breed the spider for years and years and years and never have any problems with the head wobble. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on with the genetic defects. I think it really depends on the individual and the strength of the genetics in that individual snake. As a matter of fact, I've actually seen a lot of other genes that have kinking in the spine. So I've actually seen, for example, like I've seen them in lessers that are kinked up really bad, in the ultramales, and pretty much almost all the other genes. I've just seen kind of random weird anomalies that normally you would associate with certain other genes, but I think certain genes actually get a bad rap with the genetic anomalies, even though it's kind of widespread in ball pythons. So if you actually have a kink and it happens to be one of the genes people bash on, I think it kind of gives that gene a bad name. But I think pretty much across the board it can happen just randomly in ball pythons. And keep in mind that ball pythons, I think the genetics of ball pythons is really technically unstable. You'll get the genetic defects, but you'll also get brand new genes just kind of popping up out of nowhere, and that is the strength and the weakness of the ball pythons too, the genetic instability of the species itself. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.